In the battlefield of the philosophy of science, there is a war happening, called the Science Wars. Though I believe there have been clear victories on one side with superior philosophic understanding, it seems to me that the war continues as the other side continues to produce enemies. Oh, him? He's our ferryman, and he's gonna take us to the battlefield. And this is our ship. Justified True Belief. Don't worry about that name for now. It's just a name. But there are some things you'll need to know before we get to the battlefield, where I'll invite you, yes you, to choose a side and battle. First, let's recap how we got here. In episode 1 we discussed why philosophy is important, at least because of one reason, which is an issue in the philosophy of science called demarcation. This is important to us because we want to defend ourselves against BS of people claiming to know science or have things backed by science when it really isn't. There's so much pseudoscience in health industries, things called bro science, or religious or cults disguised as science, giving themselves seemingly scientific names. We ought not lend out our scientific credentials to the non-scientific and sometimes anti-scientific communities. One actual real-world example of this was the McLean versus Arkansas case, which I went over with you in a battle between Larry Lawton and Michael Roos over the use, at least, in one of the demarcation criteria set out by Judge Overton, being Popper's falsification. The issue being that Popper's falsification is outdated and yet it was used. So then in episode 2, I talked about Karl Popper's weapon falsification because I emphasized how important it still was and showed Popper defeating the Marxist, Freudian, and Adlerian. But from that we had to move to a discussion of Kuhn's philosophy, since I kept dramatically emphasizing how one is taken as superior to the other. So in episode 3, we discussed Kuhn and how he compared his own philosophy to Popper's. This allowed us to move from a focus of falsifying theories to a move of paradigm shift. From that, we ended off discussing the gates of hell. Kuhn's philosophy led us to these gates. These gates act as access points for enemies of science advocates that wield a powerful philosophic weapon to enter onto a battlefield of the philosophy of science, philosci. It has led into a full-out philosophic war. Okay, the truth is these gates aren't really gates of hell, but there are 3 questions I promised to explain at the end of episode 3, which were how? How does Kuhn's philosophy of science open these gates? Who are these enemies that come through these gates? And sort of why, and what sort of way are they enemies? Finally, what? What is this dangerous weapon I keep going on about? Why is it so powerful? Now our ferryman will give us his account on the who and why in the next episode. He's very detailed on the who, and there are many actors in this war, so there is much work for me to do to present it. For now, I'll just briefly explain how Kuhn's conception brings about a gate or access for enemies of science. As we learned in episode 3, anomalies accumulate, crisis is induced, and as a community, we may switch to a competing paradigm, hence a scientific revolution. But the issue is, what is really happening between paradigms? According to Kuhn, what really makes science, a mature science at least, is normal science, where a paradigm, a shared theory among a community, is established and committed to. And when the commitment of that community is being challenged, he describes scientists as behaving more like philosophers, because the decision between paradigms is not informed by the experiments, since a particular paradigm is required to decide which experiments to conduct and how to interpret the results from those experiments. In the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he has a section called The Nature and Necessity of Scientific Revolutions, where he says, like the choice between competing political institutions, that between competing paradigms proves to be a choice between incompatible modes of community life. Because it has that character, the choice is not and cannot be determined merely by the evaluative procedures characteristic of normal science. for these depend in part upon a particular paradigm, and that paradigm is at issue. When a paradigm enters, as they must, into debate about paradigm choice, their role is necessarily circular. Each group uses its own paradigm to argue in that paradigm's defense. So again, what he means here, and I described this kind of quickly in the previous episode, is that each paradigm sort of supports itself. He does say though, however, that even though this is kind of circular, and that one might have to posit the paradigm in order to argue about how the evidence or the experiments within that paradigm is something we should assent to, that practice could still be persuasive socially. Even though it is circular, this is actually circular reasoning if we have to posit the paradigm in order to argue for it by presenting the empirical evidence. This circularity, though, makes it kind of irrational in that there isn't sufficient reasoning. Circular reasoning is never taken as sufficient. But again, the demonstration of experiments and the resolving of puzzles within a paradigm can be persuasive. He also says, as in political revolutions, so in paradigm choice, there is no standard higher than the assent of the relevant community. So again, the paradigm shift, is not informed, quote-unquote, rationally by experiment. Now, I've noticed there are entrails of positivism here, but I'll leave that for discussion in the future. It's just that it seems to imply that the experiments is not really what tells us which paradigm to select. Now, to help with me, I'm going to quote a small part of Paradigms and Phenomena, the Importance of Reality, an essay I wrote in 2011, where certainly I got things wrong, but the part I will use will definitely still inform us. I wrote, prior to this conception, the Kuhnian conception, it was more easily accepted that phenomena or observations, experimental results, matters of fact, etc., are being dealt with in some direct manner, and this should in some way ensure the objective nature of science. But under the Kuhnian description of science, these phenomena are also subsumed under a paradigm. They are essentially viewed through a narrow perspective specifically geared by the scientist's respective paradigm. Kuhn credits N.R. Hanson, who speaks about observations being theory-laden, for which he shares the same concern. If phenomena are theory-laden, in a sense endowed by the preconceptions of a paradigm, then they cannot act to give objective substance to the decisions of the scientist. They are owned by the problems that self-governed paradigms have. The perceived problem, to surmise, is that paradigms are self-governed, in that they are internally coherent and need only meet its own internal criteria for acceptance, which means a choice between paradigms cannot be made by the scientist, nor can a decision be based on the phenomena given they are theory-laden and thus subsumed under a paradigm. The decision then is left to social and political matters. Thus, the success or failure of a scientific paradigm depends not on reality, but on our social convention. And I argue in this paper that this is the misunderstanding which undervalues the role of phenomena, but it was, or still is, taken this way by many. Now, I mentioned N.R. Hanson as being credited with the idea of facts being theory-laden, that facts are always sort of interpreted, that everything is sort of observed through the lens of a paradigm. But it's not just N.R. Hanson, but also Mary Hess and as well Pierre Duhem, who has helped move away from this seemingly naive perspective that we can sort of objectively interpret and state what we have interpreted through our perception in science. Moving again away from positivism and even Popper. Now, truly understanding how it is that basic phenomena from doing experiments and seeing the results of those experiments are actually interpreted by a paradigm or a theory that we're using can seem sort of unfamiliar for people who don't have much experience in the battlefield of philosophy. However, again, many noobs, we might say, newbies, people fresh to these ideas, might first really want to insist that we can objectively see something as it is. We can see results, that the cat is on the mat, or that something appears to be a certain color seems to be an objective statement corresponding to objectively how reality is presented to us. But these things are in fact questionable, and not in small part because of how much science and psychology has shown us that these things are actually influenced by the perceiver. And I don't mean in any sort of Bohr interpretation of quantum physics where the perceiver is collapsing variables or anything like that, but only that our perception of reality does come by having a sort of filter through our eyes. And to get into Hanson might actually be helpful in explaining this to get people to adjust to this idea. So maybe I will devote an episode to explaining this, an episode to Hanson and Hess. If you think that's a good idea, tell me in the comments below. And if we're assuming it's only the experiments which can yield the rationality of progress, then it appears that paradigm shifts are irrational. This is what Lakatos or Lakatos, or I'm sorry if I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but this is what Lakatos says. For instance, in Kuhn's conception, anomalies, inconsistencies always abound in science, but in normal periods, the dominant paradigm secures a pattern of growth, which is eventually overthrown by a crisis. Crisis is a psychological concept. It is a contagious panic. Then a new paradigm emerges, incommensurable with its predecessor. There are no rational standards for their comparison. Each paradigm contains its own standards. The crisis sweeps away not only the old theories and rules, but also standards which made us respect them. The new paradigm brings a totally new rationality. There are no super paradigmatic standards. The challenge is a bandwagon effect. Thus, in Kuhn's view, scientific revolution is irrational, a matter for mob psychology. The space between paradigms is taken by many, therefore, as void of rationality and logic, and more a matter of psychology for a community. This assumes, however, a rational social dichotomy, pointed out to me by Helen Longino in her book The Fate of Knowledge, which I should probably read again because I can't remember the conclusion to it, but anyway, that which is social is not taken as rational. Something is either rationally informed, like logic or doing math, or it's social and people discuss and debate and have dialogue, which is not taken to be as equal, rationally speaking, and in fact, that latter seemingly being void of that rational, formal determinant, let's say. So from that, it's taken that paradigm shifts aren't determined by proper reasoning, and not by experiments, but things like social reasons and psychological reasons, persuasive things. And so we can't really measure one paradigm as being greater than another or somehow closer to truth, only that we know we have switched from one paradigm to another, and that switch was, while induced by crisis, wasn't really made on a seemingly rational basis. At least this is how it's taken. Now there are responses to this, such as Larry Lauden's response and of course Lakatos' response. Lakatos, who wants to defend Popper or will revamp Popper, combining Popper's idea of falsification into what can fit into a more Kuhnian conception, hence why I had visualized it this way. But for now, it is between those paradigms that the social or psychological plays a role. Social? Sociology? Enter the SSK movement. To question the legitimacy and in a way the superiority of science, as if it breaks down its rationality between paradigms, it becomes more a matter of social studies than it does of rational discussion and progress. Now, to make a note, I call them enemies because they are enemies to scientific advocates, or the advocates of science. And to better explain that, our ferryman will do that in the next episode. But keep in mind that I don't really mind that they are enemies or that enemies would exist. Of course, philosophers keep battling. But when it comes to science and questioning its legitimacy, it does very much directly affect our world. Think about how people might deny the science of global warming, or the science of many other things, in which case science does state something and others feel threatened. Choosing to question the legitimacy of science seems to be an option for them. So this issue does affect how we live our life, and perhaps in a great extreme, especially when it comes to global warming, whether or not the human species will even survive. In any case, this was just a short explanation to how Kuhn's paradigms and the paradigm shifts within Kuhnian conception of science gave an access for those who want to question the legitimacy of science to enter in onto the philosophic battlefield of the philosophy of science, that is, sociologists. But not all, a specific movement, the SSK movement. Let's take from our ferryman, Stephen Cole, a sociologist himself, who will give his account of what he calls voodoo sociology.